He didn't hunt in the dark. He waited in daylight, wearing a doctor's coat, while people walked willingly into silence. This was Paris during the war, a city where fear didn't scream. It learned to whisper. People vanished without struggle, without witnesses, without urgency, not because they were forced, but because they believed they were being helped. Tonight, this is not a story about brutality. It's a story about trust, and how, in a broken system, trust can become the most dangerous thing of all. What happened here wasn't hidden in shadows. It happened in plain sight, quietly, repeatedly. And for far too long, no one stopped to ask why. Paris under occupation did not feel like a city in collapse. It felt like a city holding its breath. The streets were still there, cafes still opened in the mornings, trams ran, schedules were posted, and people queued with ration cards folded carefully in their pockets. Life did not stop. It narrowed. It became procedural. Paperwork governed everything. Identity documents, permits, stamps, signatures, curfews were announced, then quietly absorbed into routine. People learned which streets to avoid at certain hours, which conversations to end early, which questions not to ask at all. Compliance was rarely dramatic. It was practical. In occupied Paris, fear did not arrive as panic. It arrived as background noise. Psychologically, this matters. Chronic fear behaves differently from sudden terror. It does not trigger constant alarm. Instead, it reshapes judgment over time. Under sustained threat, the mind learns to conserve energy. Decisions become smaller, moral questions become expensive. People begin to prioritize stability over clarity. Disappearance in this context did not feel exceptional. Someone failed to return home. A neighbor stopped coming to work. An apartment went dark and stayed that way. At first, these absences raised questions. Then explanations followed, often incomplete, often secondhand. They left. They were questioned. They had papers. Each explanation carried just enough detail to close the emotional loop. Over time, the question shifted, not where did they go, but is it safer not to know? This is a crucial psychological transition. When uncertainty becomes dangerous, curiosity turns into a liability. Asking questions risks attention. Attention risks consequence. So silence becomes adaptive. It is not apathy, it is self-preservation. From a cognitive perspective, prolonged stress compresses bandwidth. People under constant threat simplify their mental models of the world. They rely on heuristics, shortcuts that allow quick decisions with limited information. Authority becomes one of those shortcuts. Uniforms, titles, official language, these signals reduce uncertainty, even when they should invite scrutiny. Fear narrows the range of acceptable doubt. Under these conditions, partial explanations feel sufficient. An answer does not need to be complete. It only needs to be plausible enough to restore a sense of order. This is why rumors spread quickly, but investigations stall. Why stories circulate, but details fade. The system itself reinforces this narrowing. Occupied cities operate under layered control. Local administration continues, but under supervision. Policing exists, but priorities shift. Resources are fragmented. Responsibility is blurred. When authority is everywhere, accountability is nowhere specific. Psychologically, this creates diffusion. No single institution feels fully responsible. No single absence feels urgent enough, and so disappearance becomes normalized, not emotionally neutral, but emotionally distant. People grieve quietly. They worry selectively. They learn to separate what is tragic from what is survivable. It is important to pause here and be precise. This is not yet a story about a crime. It is a story about conditions. Conditions that reward compliance over confrontation. Conditions that punish visibility more than wrongdoing. Conditions where trust becomes transactional, offered not because it is earned, but because it reduces immediate fear. In such an environment, individuals do not act irrationally, they act adaptively. They accept limited information because seeking more carries risk. They rely on official roles because verifying them is costly. They move forward because stopping to question feels dangerous. From a psychological standpoint, this is how systems fail quietly, not through chaos, but through routine, not through screams, but through silence, not through sudden collapse, but through gradual accommodation. And when later events are examined in isolation, they can appear incomprehensible. But when placed back into this environment, this constant, low-grade fear, they begin to make a different kind of sense. Understanding this atmosphere is essential, because what follows did not unfold in darkness. It unfolded in a city that had learned slowly and reluctantly how to live with uncertainty and how to look away just enough to survive. There were multiple victims in this case. That fact is established. They did not vanish all at once. They disappeared over time, in separate moments, through ordinary decisions, appointments kept, meetings attended, doors willingly opened. There were no public scenes, no alarms, no immediate recognition that something irreversible had occurred. From a psychological perspective, that detail alone is significant. Most crimes that remain in public memory do so because they rupture daily life. They interrupt, they shock, they demand attention. This case did something else entirely. It blended in. Over the years, it has often been described with language that leans toward the extreme, words that suggest monstrosity, madness, or aberration. Those descriptions are understandable. They offer emotional distance. They allow us to place what happened outside the boundaries of normal human behavior. But that framing may obscure many more than it reveals. When we focus exclusively on the idea of a monster, we stop examining the environment that allowed harm to unfold repeatedly and quietly. We stop asking how ordinary systems, medical authority, wartime bureaucracy, social trust interacted with individual behavior. The story becomes exceptional, when in many ways it was tragically procedural. This analysis approaches the case differently. It does not attempt to recreate events moment by moment. It does not linger on suffering. It does not speculate beyond the record. There will be no reenactments, no graphic detail, no unverified accusations or dramatic reconstructions. Those elements may create impact, but they rarely create understanding. Instead, this case is examined as a psychological study of trust and authority under strain, of how people decide whom to believe when information is scarce and fear is constant, of how social blind spots form, not because people are careless, but because attention itself becomes risky. Trust, in this context, is not naive, it is adaptive. Under chronic threat, trust is often extended towards symbols of stability. Titles, credentials, calm voices, orderly procedures. These signals reduce uncertainty. They allow the mind to rest briefly in a world that offers little rest at all. Authority functions similarly. It simplifies decision-making. When verification is difficult or dangerous, authority becomes a cognitive shortcut. This does not mean people stop thinking. It means they begin thinking economically. The danger arises when these shortcuts go unexamined. Social blind spots are rarely the result of indifference. More often, they are the result of prioritization. Communities under stress learn what demands attention and what can be quietly set aside. Certain absences are explained away. Certain inconsistencies are tolerated. Silence becomes a form of coordination. From the outside, this can look like failure. From the inside, it often feels like survival. This is why the case deserves careful psychological analysis rather than sensational retelling, not because the acts were unprecedented, but because the conditions that allowed them are disturbingly familiar. Versions of these dynamics appear whenever institutions are overloaded, whenever fear outpaces information, whenever trust becomes a tool for coping rather than a judgment based on evidence. By slowing the narrative down, patterns emerge that are otherwise missed. Decisions that seem irrational begin to appear constrained. Behaviors that look incomprehensible begin to reflect the limits of human cognition under pressure. This approach also respects the victims. It does not reduce them to symbols or statistics. It acknowledges that they acted within the bounds of what seemed reasonable at the time, given what they knew and what they could not know. Understanding those constraints is not an excuse for what happened. It is a refusal to simplify it. To understand this case psychologically, we have to resist the urge for speed. We have to tolerate ambiguity. We have to accept that some questions will remain unanswered. Because this story is not about sudden chaos, it is about gradual accommodation. And to understand what happened, we have to slow down, far more than history usually allows. When examining this case, the most responsible place to begin is not interpretation, but documentation. The historical record establishes that the central figure was publicly known as a physician operating in occupied Paris. This professional identity was not informal or hidden. It was visible, credentialed, and, at the time, largely uncontested. Medical practice continued during the occupation, and physicians occupied a complicated social position, simultaneously regulated, relied upon, and often insulated by their perceived utility. According to records entered at the time, Marcel Petiot presented himself openly within that role. He maintained a practice, he received visitors, he interacted with people who were actively seeking assistance in leaving France or securing safety under increasingly dangerous conditions. These interactions were not clandestine in their initial form. Appointments were made. Meetings occurred indoors, during normal hours, without immediate signs of coercion or disorder. What is confirmed is the existence of repeated contact between the physician and individuals who later disappeared. These contacts were documented indirectly through correspondence, testimony from acquaintances, and personal effects recovered later. There is no single list that captures every interaction. Instead, the record forms a pattern through accumulation. That pattern matters. Each interaction, taken alone, appeared routine. Someone seeking help, someone offering a solution, an exchange framed as procedural rather than emotional. This is one of the reasons suspicion was delayed. Nothing about these encounters demanded immediate alarm. They fit within the logic of the time. The discovery that ultimately shifted the case occurred only after material evidence was found. This discovery did not come from a proactive investigation into disappearances, but from a localized report that prompted authorities to enter a specific property. What they encountered there, entered into the official record, was evidence indicating that multiple individuals had not simply passed through, but had met an irreversible end. The nature of that evidence is well documented, but it does not require graphic description to be understood. Personal belongings were recovered, human remains were identified. Records of transactions and stored items suggested repetition rather than an isolated incident. These findings were later verified through formal examination and witness corroboration. It is important to emphasize the sequence here. The evidence did not emerge because disappearances were actively connected. The connections were made only after evidence forced them to be. From an analytical standpoint, this sequence highlights the power of professional legitimacy. A physician occupies a role associated with care, confidentiality, and authority. That role does not simply inspire trust, it actively suppresses doubt. Questioning a medical professional requires both confidence and access, resources that were scarce under occupation. Routine interactions further obscured abnormal outcomes. When meetings follow a predictable script, an address, a time, a stated purpose, the mind categorizes them as safe. Even when individuals failed to return, the initial assumption was not foul play, but bureaucratic delay, relocation, or detention elsewhere. The record shows no immediate challenge to these assumptions. There were no early complaints that triggered inquiry, no coordinated reports of concern. Each disappearance existed in isolation, explained away by context. War provided explanations faster than investigation could. Only when physical evidence disrupted this pattern did the system respond. At that point, the response was procedural and thorough. The case moved from rumor to record, from individual absence to documented fact. What the record confirms, then, is not just a sequence of events, but a process failure shaped by environment. Legitimacy delayed suspicion, routine masked repetition. Authority simplified decisions that, in retrospect, required scrutiny. These are not moral judgments, they are structural observations. Understanding this confirmed timeline does not explain everything, but it establishes the ground on which interpretation must stand. Without it, analysis risks drifting into speculation. With it, we can begin to see how an extraordinary outcome emerged from a series of interactions that appeared, at the time, entirely ordinary. Beyond what is firmly documented, the case is surrounded by accounts that emerge only after the fact. These testimonies, offered by acquaintances, neighbors, intermediaries, and later witnesses, form a second layer of information. They are valuable, but they are not definitive. From a psychological standpoint, this distinction matters. Most of these statements were given after the discovery of physical evidence, not before. Memory under those conditions does not function as a neutral archive. It is shaped by shock, fear, and the pressure to make sense of what has already been revealed. Details that once felt insignificant acquire new weight. Ordinary moments are reinterpreted through a lens of hindsight. This may indicate why many accounts align in tone but diverge in detail. Some witnesses recalled conversations that seemed unusual only in retrospect. Others described behaviors that felt off without being able to articulate precisely why. A calm demeanor, a procedural manner, a confidence that now appears unsettling but at the time felt reassuring. We don't know whether these impressions were present in the moment or constructed later as the mind searched for warning signs it believes it should have noticed. Trauma complicates recall. Under stress, memory becomes less chronological and more associative. People remember fragments, sounds, phrases, emotions, rather than sequences. When asked to reconstruct events months or years later, they may unintentionally fill gaps with inference rather than observation. The record reflects this uncertainty. Accounts conflict on timelines. Descriptions vary in emphasis. Some details appear in one testimony and disappear in another. This does not mean witnesses were dishonest. It means they were human. The wartime context deepens these limitations. Documentation during occupation was inconsistent by necessity. Records were lost, destroyed, never created, or deliberately obscured. Movements across borders often left no trace. Informal networks operated outside official oversight. Even legitimate transactions could vanish into administrative voids. As a result, entire stretches of time remain undocumented. The record is silent on many questions that feel central. How often certain meetings occurred, what was said in private conversations, which intermediaries understood more than they admitted. We don't know whether some individuals sensed danger and chose not to act, or whether no such signal ever appeared. We don't know whether earlier intervention was possible, or whether the available information would always have seemed insufficient at the time. This is where responsible analysis must slow down. It is tempting to bridge these gaps with narrative, to turn probability into certainty, to treat patterns as proof. But probability is not evidence, and coherence is not confirmation. There is a difference between what likely happened and what can responsibly be said. What likely happened can be inferred from repetition, opportunity, and outcome. It can suggest motive, method, or intent in broad terms. These inferences help us understand how events may have unfolded. What can responsibly be said is narrower. It respects the limits of surviving data. It acknowledges uncertainty without treating it as failure. In this case, the record suggests a process that unfolded gradually, shielded by routine and authority. It suggests that trust was extended not once, but repeatedly. It suggests that warning signs, if they existed, were subtle enough to be absorbed into normalcy. But the record cannot prove every step of that process. It cannot reconstruct every decision. It cannot restore voices that were never recorded. What remains is a landscape shaped by absence. From a psychological perspective, that absence is not empty. It tells us about the conditions under which memory fractures, documentation thins, and explanation becomes retrospective rather than preventative. Understanding this boundary between suggestion and proof is essential. Without it, analysis becomes accusation. With it, we are forced to confront a more uncomfortable truth, that some aspects of this case will always remain out of reach, not because they were hidden well, but because the moment they occurred offered no reason at the time to preserve them. And that silence, too, is part of the record. The victims in this case were not defined by a single background, profession, or personality. They did not share one life story. What they shared was a moment in history and a psychological position shaped by it. They were individuals living under occupation. Some were attempting to flee. Some were seeking documentation, protection, or a path to safety. Others were navigating threats that were never fully articulated, but constantly implied. Their circumstances varied, but the pressures acting on them were strikingly similar. Fear was not abstract, it was immediate. For many, danger was not theoretical or distant. It was encoded in daily routines, identity checks, restricted movement, whispered warnings. Fear did not paralyze, it accelerated. Decisions had to be made quickly, often with incomplete information. Waiting carried its own risks. Urgency narrowed the field of options. Under normal conditions, people verify, consult, delay. Under occupation, those steps become liabilities. Each additional question increases exposure. Each delay increases visibility. Choices that would otherwise feel rushed become reasonable. From a psychological perspective, this urgency alters how risk is evaluated. The question is no longer, is this safe, but is this safer than the alternative? When all options carry danger, people select the one that promises structure, legitimacy, and the least immediate threat. This is where limited options matter most. The victims were not acting freely in the way peacetime analysis often assumes. They were constrained by borders, surveillance, resource scarcity, and fear of denunciation. Informal networks offered hope, but little verification. Official channels were unpredictable. Trust became a currency, traded carefully and often reluctantly. Their last known actions, keeping appointments, following instructions, bringing personal belongings, suggest a psychological state oriented toward survival, not despair. These behaviors are consistent with individuals attempting to secure continuity, to move forward, to preserve identity, to maintain control where possible. They do not suggest recklessness. There is no indication that these individuals were seeking danger or ignoring obvious threats, nor do their actions align with self-harm or resignation. On the contrary, their behavior reflects planning, intention, and belief in a future beyond the present crisis. Avoiding hindsight bias is essential here. Knowing the outcome tempts us to reinterpret earlier choices as warnings ignored, but that perspective collapses time unfairly. At the moment decisions were made, information was incomplete, and the environment was saturated with uncertainty. What appears suspicious in retrospect may have appeared procedural at the time. Psychologically, humans are meaning-making creatures. After tragedy, we search backward for clarity. We assume signs must have been visible. Often they were not. The victims acted logically, given what they knew and what they could reasonably assess. They responded to authority signals, followed processes that appeared legitimate, and made choices consistent with minimizing immediate risk. These are not failures of judgment. They are examples of adaptive reasoning under constraint. Ethically, this matters. It shifts the focus away from questioning why victims trusted and toward understanding why trust was necessary. It resists the subtle tendency to assign responsibility to those with the least power in the situation. In an irrational world, rational behavior does not guarantee safety. It only increases the odds of survival within a narrow margin. Recognizing this does not diminish the tragedy. It deepens it. It reminds us that the line between safety and harm was not drawn clearly, and that those who crossed it did so while attempting to protect themselves, not abandon themselves. Understanding the victims in this way preserves their dignity. It allows us to see them not as passive figures in a narrative of crime, but as active decision-makers navigating a world that offered no good choices, only less dangerous ones. And that distinction is central to any honest psychological analysis of what happened next. When examining the central figure in this case, the temptation is to move quickly toward labels. History often does this for us, reducing complex behavior into shorthand. Villain, monster, aberration. Those labels may feel satisfying, but they are analytically thin. A psychological reading begins elsewhere. Early records suggest a pattern of behavior marked less by chaos than by inconsistency. There were indications of impulsivity, boundary testing, and difficulty maintaining stable alignment with authority. Yet these behaviors did not consistently trigger lasting consequences. Institutions intervened, evaluated, and then released. Life continued. This may indicate not inevitability, but reinforcement. When disruptive behavior is repeatedly absorbed without resolution, it can shape expectations. Boundaries begin to feel negotiable. Consequences appear temporary. The system, rather than correcting behavior, becomes something to be navigated. The relationship with authority is particularly instructive here. Rather than positioning himself in opposition to institutions, Marcel Petiot appears to have moved alongside them. He adopted their language, their procedures, their symbols. He pursued credentials, not anonymity. He occupied roles that carried built-in legitimacy. Psychologically, this suggests a form of alignment rather than rebellion. Authority was not something to resist, but something to inhabit. Institutions offered structure, protection, and plausibility. By operating within them, scrutiny could be delayed or redirected. Questions that might have arisen in informal settings were neutralized by titles, paperwork, and professional norms. The use of professional identity as leverage is central to understanding later behavior. A physician is associated with care, discretion, and trust. This association does not need to be actively asserted. It operates automatically. People disclose information. They follow instructions. They assume intent is benevolent. In times of crisis, that assumption strengthens. This may indicate an acute awareness of how roles function psychologically, not merely as occupations, but as social signals that reduce doubt and encourage compliance. When interactions follow a familiar script, appointment, consultation, instruction, the mind relaxes. The abnormal is masked by routine. Once scrutiny began, another behavioral pattern became visible: narrative control. Rather than withdrawing or remaining silent, the central figure engaged in storytelling. Explanations were offered, motives reframed, actions repositioned within larger moral or political contexts. These narratives shifted over time, adapting to new pressures and emerging evidence. We don't know whether these stories were believed internally or deployed strategically. The record is silent on internal experience. What can be observed is the function of the storytelling itself. Psychologically, narrative serves as defense. It restores coherence when identity is threatened. It allows a person to remain the protagonist of their own account, even as external narratives close in. Storytelling can also confuse boundaries, introducing complexity where clarity would be damaging. Importantly, this behavior does not require grandiosity or delusion. It requires flexibility, the ability to adjust explanations, to read the room, to emphasize different justifications for different audiences. These are skills learned through interaction, not isolation. They suggest engagement with social feedback rather than detachment from it. At this point, a boundary must be drawn clearly. This is not a diagnosis, it is a behavioral reading. It does not attempt to name a disorder or assign internal motivations with certainty. It observes patterns, how authority was used, how trust was managed, how narratives shifted under pressure. These observations help explain how actions unfolded, not why they began. Reducing the individual to myth may make the story easier to process, but it makes it less useful. Understanding behavior without dramatization allows us to see how similar dynamics can emerge elsewhere. Whenever institutions grant legitimacy faster than they grant scrutiny, and whenever roles are trusted more than actions are examined. In that sense, the central figure is not important because he was unique. He is important because his behavior reveals how systems and individuals can intersect in ways that feel ordinary until they no longer are. Every investigation relies on a sequence: what happened, when it happened, and how those moments connect. In this case, that sequence is fractured, not because it was deliberately erased in every instance, but because much of it was never fully recorded to begin with. There are timelines that begin and then stop, dates that appear once and never reappear, periods where individuals are last seen but not last documented. These gaps are not dramatic, they are administrative, and that is precisely why they are difficult to repair. Some records were destroyed during the war. Others were displaced as offices closed, reopened, and reorganized under shifting authority. Many documents were simply never created. Informal arrangements left no paper trail. Conversations that mattered deeply were never written down. In a city operating under constant strain, documentation prioritized survival, not historical completeness. As a result, investigators working the case encountered silence where continuity should have been. They could not always determine when certain interactions occurred, only that they had occurred at some point. They could not reconstruct full movement patterns because transportation records were incomplete or inconsistent. Addresses changed, names were misspelled or altered. Entire segments of time existed without institutional memory. The record is silent on these intervals. Archival preservation added another layer of distortion. Materials were stored in different locations under different standards by agencies with different priorities. Some files were preserved meticulously, others degraded, fragmented, or vanished. What survived did so unevenly. This inconsistency matters psychologically, not just procedurally. For investigators, gaps introduce cognitive strain. The mind seeks patterns, but cannot rely on chronology. Hypotheses must be held lightly. Conclusions remain provisional. Over time, this uncertainty can erode confidence, not in the case but in the process itself. Investigators are left to work around absence rather than build upon presence. For families, the impact is more personal and enduring. Without timelines, there is no clear moment to anchor grief. Without records, there is no definitive explanation to accept or reject. Silence becomes permanent. Questions remain open, not because answers are hidden, but because they were never preserved. Psychologically, this kind of uncertainty prevents closure. It traps families in a state of suspended understanding, unable to move forward, unable to fully look back. Each missing detail carries emotional weight, not because it proves something, but because it refuses to resolve anything. Public memory is shaped by these same gaps. When documentation is incomplete, narratives compete. Some accounts harden into simplified versions. Others fade entirely. Over time, the absence of detail encourages myth-making. even among those who wish to remain factual. What cannot be confirmed becomes exaggerated or dismissed, depending on the needs of the moment. This is how cases drift from history into legend. It is important to recognize that these gaps do not imply negligence or malice on the part of investigators. They reflect the limits of what could be accessed at the time. Wartime policing lacked the tools and coordination later generations would take for granted. There was no centralized data system, no reliable way to cross-reference movements at scale, no technological means to recover what was never captured. Investigators worked within those constraints. They documented what they could, when they could, with what resources remained. What they left behind is not a failure of effort, but a record shaped by circumstance. Understanding these gaps as structural rather than intentional allows us to interpret the file with humility. It reminds us that absence is not evidence of deception, and silence is not always the result of concealment. In this case, the gaps are part of the story. They show us where systems thin under pressure, where memory fractures, where the past resists reconstruction, not because it is hidden, but because it was lived in conditions that made preservation secondary to survival. And for everyone who came later, families, investigators, historians, that silence became something they had to learn to live with. To understand how this case drifted towards silence, it is necessary to look beyond individual actions and examine the system that surrounded them, not as an abstract failure, but as a structure under extreme pressure. Wartime policing operated with severe limitations. Personnel were reduced, reassigned, or operating under external supervision. Priorities were reordered daily. Public safety competed with political enforcement, resource protection, and administrative compliance. Investigations into disappearance rarely received immediate attention unless they intersected with those priorities. This did not mean investigators lacked concern. It meant they lacked capacity. Time, manpower, and clarity were all constrained. Each case entered an already overloaded system, where urgency was defined less by human absence and more by perceived threat to order. Disappearances without visible disruption often fell lower on the list, not because they were unimportant, but because everything else felt more immediately dangerous. Jurisdictional confusion compounded these limits. Authority during occupation was layered and unstable. Local police, administrative offices, occupying forces, and parallel institutions all held partial control. Responsibility was diffuse. Information did not move cleanly between agencies, and in some cases, could not move at all. An inquiry might begin in one jurisdiction and stall in another. Records created in one office were inaccessible to the next. Investigators could not assume continuity, either in authority or in documentation. Each transition introduced delay, distortion, or loss. From a psychological standpoint, this fragmentation erodes accountability. When no single entity holds full responsibility, action becomes cautious. Decisions are deferred. Silence becomes procedural rather than intentional. Technology, or rather, the absence of it, played a decisive role. There were no centralized databases, no real-time cross-referencing, no reliable methods for tracking movement across regions or borders. Communication was slow, inconsistent, and often insecure. Once a person passed out of one system's visibility, there was little capacity to trace them. What could not be tracked could not be confirmed. What could not be confirmed could not be prioritized. Bias also shaped who was considered missing enough to warrant sustained attention. Certain disappearances were assumed to be voluntary, others were attributed to detention, relocation, or flight. Social position mattered. Access to advocates mattered. The ability to generate noise, complaints, inquiries, pressure often determined visibility. Those living on the margins were easier to lose. This bias was rarely explicit. It operated quietly, through assumptions shaped by context. In a society overwhelmed by absence, not every absence felt exceptional. Some lives were expected to move, vanish, or remain undocumented. These systemic pressures created a form of investigative triage. Cases were not ignored so much as filtered. Those with immediate threat indicators moved forward, those without stalled. Over time, stalled cases accumulated, not because they lacked importance, but because they lacked leverage within the system. This is the mechanism by which many cases become cold, not through the brilliance of a perpetrator, not through a single missed clue, but through structural overload. When systems are stretched beyond capacity, they become selective. When they are selective, patterns are missed. When patterns are missed, repetition can hide in plain sight. Understanding this shifts the moral center of the story. It does not absolve wrongdoing, it does not diminish loss, but it resists the comforting illusion that every unresolved case reflects individual failure. Often, it reflects a system asked to do more than it can sustain. In this case, the coldness did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated through delays that felt reasonable, through silences that felt unavoidable, through limitations that no single investigator could overcome. And once that accumulation reached a certain point, the past became difficult to retrieve, not because it was deliberately buried, but because the system that might have preserved it was already overwhelmed when it mattered most. With time, this case reached legal conclusions. Charges were brought, judgments were rendered, sentences were carried out. From a judicial perspective, the matter was closed, and yet, closure in law does not equal understanding in psychology. Legal outcomes are designed to establish responsibility within defined standards of proof. They determine what can be decided, not what can be fully explained. A verdict answers the question of accountability. It does not, by itself, reveal the mechanisms that allowed harm to unfold as it did. This distinction is essential. When we name an outcome, guilty, convicted, sentenced, we risk mistaking resolution for comprehension. The label becomes a stopping point. Inquiry slows. The deeper questions, the ones that resist clean answers, are set aside. Psychological understanding operates differently. It asks how behavior interacted with environment, how authority functioned as a signal, how routine normalized risk. These dynamics do not disappear once a legal line is drawn. They persist beyond the case because they are not unique to it. Later, analyses often attempt to bridge this gap by revisiting the past with modern tools. New frameworks, refined terminology, and contemporary assumptions are applied retroactively. This can be useful, but only to a point. There are limits to what hindsight can responsibly accomplish. Modern psychology benefits from concepts that were unavailable at the time. Cognitive bias, systemic failure, trauma-informed analysis. These tools help us describe patterns more precisely. They can clarify what earlier observers sensed but could not articulate. What they cannot do is recover lost data. No analytical framework can reconstruct conversations that were never recorded. No theory can supply timelines where documentation is missing. No retrospective insight can fully correct for the conditions under which information was filtered, distorted, or never preserved. The record remains bounded by what survived. This is why naming outcomes does not explain mechanisms. Knowing who was held responsible does not tell us how trust was extended repeatedly. Knowing when the case ended does not explain why it began unnoticed. These mechanisms exist upstream in decisions that felt ordinary at the time and therefore left little trace. There is also a psychological risk in retroactive certainty. When later knowledge is projected backward, ambiguity collapses. Choices that were once constrained appear obvious. Doubt is replaced by inevitability. This can create a false sense of mastery over the past. A belief that, armed with today's understanding, the outcome would have been prevented. That belief is comforting. It is also misleading. The people involved were operating without that knowledge. They navigated a world of partial information, immediate threat, and limited agency. Any analysis that ignores those constraints risks becoming moral theater rather than psychological inquiry. This does not mean later developments are without value. Legal conclusions establish boundaries. They prevent endless speculation. They anchor the case in documented fact. They affirm that harm occurred and that responsibility was assigned within the limits of the system. Psychological analysis builds on that foundation, but it does not replace it. Its role is narrower and more cautious. It identifies patterns without declaring inevitability. It examines structures without dissolving individual agency. It accepts that explanation may deepen understanding without delivering satisfaction. In this case, later developments can tell us how the story ended in court. They cannot tell us with certainty how each decision was experienced in the moment, or how risk was perceived before consequences were known. Understanding those limits is not a weakness of analysis. It is its ethical boundary. What remains is a layered truth. The law reached an end point, while psychology continues to ask questions, carefully, conditionally, and with an awareness that some mechanisms can be illuminated, but never fully restored. And that restraint is not an admission of failure. It is an acknowledgement of what responsible understanding requires. At the end of this analysis, what remains is not a solution, but a map of certainty and uncertainty, clearly marked, deliberately incomplete. There are things we know. We know the historical context in which this case unfolded. We know the pressures of occupation, the normalization of absence, and the way routine replaced vigilance. We know that multiple people disappeared over time, and that their last known actions were consistent with attempts to seek safety within a system that appeared legitimate. We know that authority, professionalism, and procedure played a central role in delaying suspicion. We know that once material evidence surfaced, the system responded within its limits and reached legal conclusions. These facts are documented. They form the stable ground of the record. There are also things we infer. We infer that trust was extended repeatedly because it reduced immediate fear. We infer that routine interactions obscured abnormal outcomes. We infer that social blind spots emerged not from indifference, but from overload, cognitive, institutional, and emotional. We infer that storytelling functioned as a means of control once scrutiny intensified. These inferences are not certainties. They are patterns that align with what is known about human behavior under chronic stress. They help us understand how events may have unfolded without claiming to reconstruct them fully. And then there are things that remain unknowable. We do not know the precise internal reasoning behind every decision. We do not know what doubts were considered and dismissed in private moments. We do not know which questions were never asked or which suspicions never formed. We do not know what might have happened if circumstances had shifted slightly, if a document had survived, if a delay had occurred, if attention had landed elsewhere. The record is silent on these points. That silence is not a failure of effort. It is a reflection of reality as it was lived. Moments pass, information decays. Systems prioritize survival over preservation. The past does not arrive intact for later examination. This is where discomfort enters. Humans seek final answers because they offer relief. A complete story promises order. It reassures us that chaos can be contained, that outcomes can be traced back to clear causes, that harm follows understandable rules. In the context of crime, resolution feels like safety, but not all stories comply with that need. Some resist completion because the conditions that shaped them also erased parts of themselves. Some remain open not because the truth is hidden, but because it was never fully recorded. In these cases, Insisting on certainty can distort rather than clarify. Ethically, this matters. To force closure where none exists risks simplifying lives and decisions that were already constrained. It risks turning uncertainty into accusation and ambiguity into spectacle. Responsible analysis requires a different posture, one that accepts limits without surrendering curiosity. Living with the unanswered does not mean abandoning understanding. It means holding understanding with restraint. It means recognizing that insight can exist without finality. That value can be found in mapping how systems fail quietly, how trust operates under pressure, and how ordinary decisions can accumulate into extraordinary harm without claiming to solve what cannot be solved. This is not a weakness of the case, it is its lesson. Some cases resist narrative completion. They ask us not for judgment, but for patience, humility, and restraint. And in accepting that request, we do not close the story. We honor it by refusing to pretend that it ever truly ended.